talking about what did they do? Why did they worship? What caused them to want to stop and praise God? Was it all spontaneous? Was any of it structured? And we've been just kind of looking through all these various scenes. Basically, we spent a lot of time in the Old Testament initially in our study. And then we moved into the New Testament, and we focused in our first few classes in the New Testament on the fact that who becomes the central figure of worship? Jesus does, right? There's worship while he's in the womb. There's worship immediately after his birth. And then last Wednesday night, we talked about the fact that there was that tremendous scene just prior to his crucifixion, right? That what often is referred to as that triumphal entrance. And there's this wonderful moment where Jesus comes in. And generally speaking, who responded favorably to his approach to Jerusalem that day? And say it one more. Right, the common folk, right? The ones that appreciated the fact that he had been helping and aiding and assisting. And in particular, what event just prior to that kind of stimulated that response when they arrived that day, or he arrived? Right, the resurrection of Lazarus had occurred just prior to that, right? And word had spread there in Jerusalem as it relates to that. And people were excited to think that the Hosanna had finally arrived, right? And so they bring that praise of worship as it relates to Jesus as that triumphal entrance occurs there on that day. It won't be long, though, until the mob mentality takes over and you hear the words crucify him instead. But that's been our focus so far, just to set into our minds and edge into our minds that Jesus becomes the central focus of attention as it relates to worship and ultimately becomes the high priest, right? And we studied that in the book of Hebrews, how it is that we approach God through him as our high priest. So that's where we've been. We're going to go into the book of Acts now for a little while starting this morning and just see a couple of extra scenes where folks who responded became disciples of Jesus. What did they do, right? How did they react to that? And what kinds of things we might be able to experience as it relates to that. But before I go any further, if you would, let's bow our heads together and let's share in a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, thank you for this day. Thank you for the blessings of life that you provide for us. The ability to just gather here, to open your word, to appreciate its testimony, and just to educate ourselves about how you would want us to live and behave, and in particular, worship you. Thank you for sharing with us these various worship scenes that we can learn from and edify ourselves from, and give us an open heart and mind today to appreciate your testimony even this morning. Guide us and direct us in all that's good and right, and we pray all these things through thy Son's name. Amen. All right, so let's jump here to Acts chapter 16, right? That's where we just finished up those scenes in relationship to Jesus. Let's jump into the book of Acts now and begin to examine this. And who do we find here in Acts chapter 16? Right? In the first couple of examples, well, that's the second example. The first example is of whom? Lydia, right? The first one we want to look at is the example of Lydia. And then a couple verses on down, we're going to talk about Paul and Silas as well. But who is she, by the way? Okay, right. What somebody said? Who said it? Seller of purple, right? That's where our minds go because that's what we learned in the little classes, right? It's what we learned in little Bible classes. Lydia was the seller of purple. She was a businesswoman. By the way, a seller of purple, where purple dyes were a high dollar commodity. Okay, high dollar commodity. And so she was in she was in a pretty lucrative kind of business here that you would find for somebody that would be a seller of purple. But let's just note the context, and then we'll talk about it a little bit. Therefore, verse 11, loosing from Troas, we came with a straight course to Samothracia, or Pittsburgh. I always say names I can't say. I just call them all Pittsburgh. And the next day to Neapolis, and from thence to Philippi, which is the chief city of that part of Macedonia, and a colony. And we were in that city abiding certain days. And on the Sabbath, we went out of the city by a riverside where prayer was wont to be made. And we sat down and spake unto the women which resorted there. And all, real quick, why on the Sabbath day? Yeah, there's not been enough time, right? Not every community and area had time to learn about Jesus, about the promises that he made, about the transitional things that are happening into the new covenant. There's going to be lots of time that occurs later on where the letters of Paul begin to be written, right? We're in a limited knowledge moment here as Paul travels to these various locations, and so he went where he knew he would find what kind of people, interestingly? Yeah, right. These are going to be religious people. He went to a location along a riverbank where he knew that people gathered on the Sabbath day to pray and to worship. It's interesting that maybe because they're there, they may not have in that small little place a central location to be able to go and worship God, right? And so you just found a place. What I appreciate about that is that we get structured in our minds, right? This is the place, right? We built this and have built onto it, and we put these nice pews, and we put air conditioning in, and we make sure everything's just nice and comfortable, and we get our imagery that this is this, but it's not always a structure, right? Worship can happen anywhere. It can happen anywhere, and these people are a great example of that. They didn't have an official, potentially no synagogue directly available to them, right? Nothing that they had direct access to, but it didn't stop them from worshiping. They found a way. People of God should always find a way, right? We should find a way. And it may not always be easy. It may not always be comfortable. It may not always have the amenities that we would like to have, right? There may not be nice fancy screens and computers to help us guide and process the order of our worship along the way, but you find a way because God is worthy. That's been our communication, right? That's what we've been learning throughout our study. Why? Because God is worthy of the worship. Jesus is worthy of the praise and the honor that gets brought before His name. And so figure it out, right? They figure it out. And so he learned that there's this group of people, and they would go down along this riverside, and they would pray. And it's interesting. He said, and to me anyway, where prayer was wont to be made, and we did what? Verse 13. We sat down. It's a side lesson maybe as it relates to our study. Why don't you think about that though? I got in trouble one time. I was teaching. I was in a college class, or I was in. I'm trying to think, was that high school? It was a high school class when I was in college, and nowhere close to here. But anyway, I was teaching this class, and the fellow that had asked me to teach the class found out that I sat down while I taught that class. And he took me aside and he said, "Brian, I don't know whether we really should be sitting down when we teach a class. You should be standing in front of those students. You should be." And I thought, no. There's appropriate times for that, right? There's appropriate times when the size of the classroom is large enough and you want to be heard and you need to, but sometimes it's just as effective to be what? Yeah, among them, with them. Yeah. Yeah, this wasn't Paul coming to town to tell these folks, hey, this is what you ought to, right here. This not this authoritative kind of approach. He just joined himself to them and begins to have a conversation with this audience of people. There's a valuable lesson to me there, that sometimes it's not about this tree stump approach where you're getting above and you're lecturing, or sometimes the best approach is just to get among them and start having a conversation of what's going on. And that bridge actually that he builds then begins to have a response. Verse 14, a certain woman named Lydia, a seller of purple of the city of Thyatira, which worshipped God, heard us, whose heart the Lord opened, that she attended unto the things which were spoken of Paul. Well, and I'm not asking you to just reread the text, but in some way, so what, prior to this scene, what was her consistent behavior? Yeah, worshiping God was a consistent behavior, right? It wasn't something that she just happened to do this day. It wasn't something that was just momentary for her. It was a consistent behavior. She which worshiped, which implies a continual process, right? This is somebody that was worshiping God consistently. And because of that, I would argue that that allows for her heart to be what? Open and receptive. Open and receptive. One of the things that I think we can appreciate from that is simply this, that even when we're struggling, worship is the best place to be, right? Because that's, right, I may not be perfect. I may be challenged by something. There may be something going on in my life that's a difficulty that I'm trying to resolve or answer. But worship is where I need to be, because that worship, that continual, consistent connectivity of my worship to God and the collective group of people that I'm worshiping with will hopefully keep my heart softened enough to be receptive to when God teaches and instructs and guides. It's interesting, right? And I'm not judging here, but I just want you to think about it. What's generally one of the first signs of a struggle in faith? Lack of attending worship services, right? It's one of the first, right, reactions sometimes that we begin to have is we begin to no longer see the priority of worshiping. And maybe the reason for that is because every time I come into that worship, it's doing what? It's working on my heart. It's working on my heart. And if I don't want my heart worked on, then I get out of that environment, right? What I love about her is she was ready for what God was sharing with her through Paul because she stayed consistent. So I encourage you, right? There may be times where we're just wrestling with our relationship with God, and but don't abandon the activity of worship that may keep your heart soft enough that when the right moment occurs, it can turn you back to the Creator. Go ahead, Bob.
We have a structured worship time. When we assemble ourselves together on the first day of the week to worship, which we are commanded to do, we're not to forsake the assembling. Yet, through this study, we find that you can worship God anytime, any place. But there has to be a difference between the two different types of worship.
Yeah. Well, and I do think there is. I think we're going to see that in Acts chapter 20, where the disciples very specifically gathered together on the first day of the week, right? There are scenes that we'll look at before our study is over, where it was very structured in the sense of the right time, the right moment, the right reasons, the right functions and purposes. And other times it's more spontaneous. And right now for these folks, it's basically based on their Jewish heritage. It's why they're gathering on the Sabbath day. And so there's structure in that sense to them, as it's not coincidental that it's on the Sabbath that they're out there along the riverside. But yet you just see this very generic approach, though, no real structured guidance. And when Paul gets there, he just sits down among them and begins to have this conversation. And her response to the gospel is positive, right, in verse 15. She reacts to the message because she's got this open heart and receptiveness to those things. So what else did you see there? I shared with you along the path some of the things I noticed about that worship scene. What did you see in that text that maybe we didn't talk about as it relates to worship? You all just wrote down the same things I wrote down, right? Same thing.
You said, technology, these guys didn't have technology. But you know what? The technology now should make us even more able to access things to facilitate.
And I agree with Kim. It's interesting. We are in a time period where there are very few hindrances to worshiping and yet sometimes people are more or less interested than, you know what I mean? It's interesting that we've got every convenience. It should be simple for us. We've got convenient places. We've got comfortable places. We've got, to think about the access, the ability that we can, used to be we would say it's easy to have one of these. Well, now you can have one of these and carry it with you, right? It's very simple, and yet we can let that go. Go ahead.
I'd like to reiterate what the brother said just now. We're taught down in Crum, where I'm from, there is two types of worship. There's the Sunday worship, which is the first day of the week, because there's 5 acts of worship: sing, pray, preach, give, and then the communion. You don't do that at any other time other than the first day of the week. Any other time, you can sing, pray, and then teach, which is preach, teach. But you can't do the communion and you don't give.
Right.
First day of the week worship and every other day.
Well, certainly, absolutely, because there's that is structured, right? When this communion is to be offered and partaken of is guided and has restriction and has guidance as to when, how, what it's supposed to be. All of that's in there. So there certainly is a distinction between the kinds of worship that happens, and we see it in these various scenes that we come across. They don't even know about commemorating Jesus yet, this audience of people. All they know is the Jewish history that's led them to that point. Any other thoughts? All good.
I think this is another time when Paul took advantage of circumstance. He knew where the people would be.
Yeah.
And many times he went to the synagogues.
Yeah.
He knew people would be there, and he didn't have to go out and round up people.
Yeah. It got Paul in trouble a lot, but Paul went wherever he knew people would be that would be willing to talk to him about these religious matters. And sometimes that was in a Jewish community that might have a group of facts gathering in a synagogue, or it may be right among the people who are making the idols to some goddess of Diana, and that can create a whole other set of challenges for him too. But he did. He went wherever the people were. And in particular, he finds people who were worshiping. We find him in the synagogue beckoning with the hand, right? He's asking for his turn, respecting their worship, by the way, but asking for his turn to be able to speak before that audience. And that's another scene. We didn't put it in our list, but that's another scene that we could evaluate.
Well, another reason Paul was here was because that wasn't his original destination.
Yeah.
He was called, or he had a vision.
Yeah.
Telling him to come to Macedonia, don't go.
Right. There's some very peculiar ways that these scenes are unfolding because of the way that God's guiding the travel and purposes that Paul has.
This was a very small group. They were in a populous area, but they were a small group, but they still came together to worship.
Yeah, great catch. They didn't let their limitations hinder their willingness to worship, and we should appreciate that about them. They didn't require a large number of people in order to still bring their worship before God.
I can't help but notice verse 15, after she was baptized,
Mm-hmm.
she besought them to stay with her.
Yeah.
I think oftentimes we hinder ourselves. We allow ourselves to overthink and not reach out to others and be more helpful and do such things that could further.
Yeah. And what I appreciate about that aspect of this scene is I like the word in King James says, and she constrained us, right? She wasn't taking no, right? She wanted them to stay and was very strong in the desire to want to know more, learn more. If the Lord's found me faithful, stay and help me even further.
And so she wanted to hear more from Paul.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So a soft heart helps, right? A malleable, approachable heart can help us in this matter. Let's jump down to verse 19. And let's look, and we could start in verse 16 just to get the background of what's going on. So it comes to pass then, as they went to prayer, a certain damsel possessed with a spirit of divination met us, which brought her masters much gain by soothsaying. The same followed Paul and us, and cried, saying, These men are the servants of the Most High God, which show unto us the way of salvation. Now, it's fascinating, right? I mean, there's a whole other aspect of this story that's not part of our theme in terms of our study, but it's fascinating that here's this one that's got this spirit of divination. She's been able to be pretty profitable to those who controlled her, and she sees Paul and those that were traveling with him, and she starts crying out, these men are the servants of the Most High God. These are folks who are going to show you the way of salvation. And she did this for many days, the text says in verse 18. And Paul, being grieved, turned and said to the spirit, I command thee in the name of Jesus Christ to come out of her. And he came out the same hour. I don't know why, right? The text doesn't say why Paul was grieved. I've got my speculation about that, right? I imagine it's quite a distraction when he's trying to go about and find individuals that he can share and talk to and convey the gospel message, and you've got this kind of boisterous woman that everywhere they go, she's shouting. And so maybe that's the challenge. Maybe he's just grieved over the fact that she's got this spirit about her that needs to be corrected. That could be what's grieving him, to witness this. But irregardless, again, not our topic, but he resolves that, and he removes that spirit of divination from her. And when their masters saw that the hope of their gains was gone, they caught Paul and Silas and drew them into the marketplace under the rulers, and brought them to the magistrates, saying, These men, being Jews, do exceedingly trouble our city, and teach customs which are not lawful for us to receive, neither to observe, being Romans. And the multitude rose up together against them, and the magistrates rent off their clothes and commanded to beat them. I've always been fascinated by that time period where that seemed to be the answer to everything. Anybody you didn't like, just beat them. And that's what they did. They did it with Paul. They did it with other of the apostles. They did it with Jesus, right? That just seemed to be the way. So they laid many stripes on them. They throw them into the prison and charge the jailer to keep them safely, who having received such a charge, thrust them into the inner prison and made their feet fast in the stocks. So just pause for a moment. Let's get the historical background before we see the scene. So the pattern's been, Paul's been going out with these groups. He's out going to prayer. This woman who's got the spirit of divination keeps following them around, shouting, These men are from the Most High God. They've got salvation in their hands. It disturbs everybody. Grieves Paul enough that he resolves that challenge. As soon as that spirit leaves her, she no longer has the ability to generate the revenue that she once did. Her masters don't like that, and they go and take Paul and Silas to the rulers, who basically inflict harm against them and then throw them in prison for this. Here's where we're getting to, though. Here's what Paul and Silas's response to that is. And at midnight, Paul and Silas prayed and sang. Now, notice the word. Paul and Silas prayed and sang praises unto God, and the prisoners heard them. If that would have read, and at midnight Paul and Silas prayed and sang laments unto God, I might understand that a little easier, right? Right? We could see that imagery where maybe you might be praying and then singing songs of sorrow and challenge. But that doesn't seem to be the picture here, right? What seems to be the imagery is they're singing praises. I was just beaten with many lashes, been mistreated for doing nothing but help this woman resolve this spirit of divination that was when all I'm doing is preaching a message of hope and promise and salvation in Jesus. And this is the response and reaction. The next thing I know, I'm not just in prison, but I'm where? Yeah. He said, and he made their feet fast in the stocks. Anybody ever done that? Anybody ever been in stocks before? I have. In Williamsburg, Virginia. Outside of that old courthouse, if you ever go to Williamsburg, Virginia, and you visit, that Colonial Williamsburg, there's it's been years since I've been there, but outside that courthouse, there were these wooden stocks, and you could get it. Now, fortunately, they didn't have locks on them because my family probably would have just left me there. But 30 seconds. 30 seconds, and I'm like, no, this ain't, this, no. I'm ready to, okay, I've done it. It's time to move on to the next thing, right? Not a pleasant experience, and not really to the level that, what's my point, friends? That's what they're in when this is happening. This isn't a padded pew in an air-conditioned building in the middle of Payton City, West Virginia. I'm in the middle of a prison. I was just brutally abused. My feet are now fast in the stocks. That could mean different things depending on time period, situation, who's in charge, what they had. I get it. May not be exactly what we had in Williamsburg, Virginia. That's not my point. But my point is this isn't comfortable. Yeah. I mean, physically, your mind may go everywhere but worship. Now, you see the hesitancy in my voice here because I'm going to throw the qualifier first, and then, but I want you to think about it. There are legitimate reasons why I may not be able to come into this building and worship, right? There may be physical calamities that I have that just simply won't allow me to physically gather with those who are worshiping. And yet, if worship's on the mind of Paul and Silas in this moment, there are probably some things in my life I could probably overcome that I let be a challenge to me that are far less significant than what's happening here. And that's not a judgment statement. That's a challenge statement. To think about that, right? Before I create the 35 reasons why I can't assemble and worship God, then maybe pause and think about guys like Paul and Silas, who know it wasn't an assembly, but they're in a miserable condition. And what's on their mind is praying and singing praises to God. It should be always on our mind, and we should always find a way. It's similar to what we saw earlier, right? And maybe we could work towards overcoming some of the things that challenge us. Some things can't be overcome, but some things maybe could. And we could improve on our desire to want, even when life isn't great, to want to find a way to worship. In the middle of the night, here are Paul and Silas, and they're praying, and they're singing praises to their Creator. And it has an impact, right? Because who else is listening to that? The other prisoners. The other prisoners are witness to that scene. And it's impressing them. Just read on a little bit. We're kind of the part, but suddenly there's an earthquake so that the foundation of the prison were shaken, and immediately all the doors were open and everyone's bands were loose. So now the bands are gone, right? They've been loose. And the keeper of the prison, awakened out of his sleep and seeing the prison doors open, he drew out a sword and would have killed himself because he assumed what? They're gone, right? His assumption is they're gone. But here's what's always impressed me about this. But Paul cried with a loud voice, saying, "Do thyself no harm, for we are all here." Friends, I simply offer to you that if that praise and worship to God did not impact all those other prisoners, they would have been out that door as soon as it opened. What kept them there, right? Not Paul and Silas. I get why they're still there. They understand this is just part of what they're doing as servants of God. Why did the rest of those prisoners stay? They can appreciate what they had experienced with now we don't have any idea. We know what happens with the Philippian jailer, right? We know Paul gets to have a conversation with him. His household learns about Jesus and the promises of salvation. We see the response to that. It's all part of this piece of story. But what I simply want us to note about this worship scene is that the praise and worship that was offered by Paul and Silas was so impactful that none of those prisoners apparently even thought about leaving. Now, you could talk about that as God, right? God created the earthquake. God loosened the stalks. God opened the doors. I get it, right? There's that element of this. But it's impressive to think about that these prisoners had been listening long enough that they chose not to leave.
Sit there and sing, anything like that. They did that on their own.
Yeah.
And that just goes to show you that the type of example that you lead by your behavior around other people.
Yeah. And that is impressive about that, right? There's a lot of work of God here, right? The earthquake, but the choice to offer prayers and songs of praise was their choice. Something they decided because of who they were and what they wanted in that scene. Anything else you saw? What else do you think about when you see this?
So our worship can affect others.
Yeah. So worship can be impactful. The edification that it can bring towards others, the encouragement that it can bring to others, the way that it can teach and admonish other people is witnessed here in a not a church setting, but in a prison setting. These men are moved when they witness and hear the worship of others. What else do you see? One more time, son.
Defiance.
Yeah. Against those that imprisoned them, and right
Because of their religion. They was teaching religion. So the way they defied it was they said, well, we're not going to let them keep us down. We're going to worship God no matter what.
Yeah.
So they did it in defiance as one reason. And then another reason was because of prisoners.
Yeah, sure. And I agree with you. I think it is an act of defiance because, right, you can throw us in this prison, but it won't change who we are and what we're about. And you can appreciate that about them. That it would have been simpler probably if they just stayed quiet. You know, there were other times where apostles were caught and taken and brought before rulers, and they were basically said, if you'll just quit, we'll just let you go. And John and others would have to say, well, you judge. But for us, we're going to continue to proclaim boldly the message of Jesus. And so it could have been easier on them if they had just done nothing and been quiet. And the rulers may have backed away, but they just defiantly continue to worship, praise, and be who they are as servants of God. True faith? Yeah. What else do you see? Thought of when you read through that?
That we should never be afraid to proclaim our faith and that we are a Christian, no matter where we're at or who we're dealing with. Because sometimes we want to shy away and maybe see what the situation is, and we don't know if we want the people around us to know we are Christian, but we need to do that.
It's an interesting venue they're in, isn't it? And you might think, well, the fellows sitting in this prison, most of them, I guess I can't judge that, why they were in there. I guess there could have been other political kinds of prisoners in there. But generally speaking, they're in there for a reason, a crime, right? If you remember with the scene with Jesus, who do you want me to release? You want me to release Jesus or Barabbas? And Barabbas was a known felon to them, and they chose him to be released. So my point to what Sherry's talking about is that didn't faze them, that this seemed to be an odd location to be praising and worshiping God didn't change the fact that they were willing to do that, despite who heard it, how they responded and reacted. Good, Jeff.
Joy.
Yeah.
Count it all joy when you are persecuted for the Lord's sake.
Yeah. They were able to find joy in the moment, despite the challenge that they were in, and they did count it all joy because of.
I think because of the challenge that they were in.
Yeah, I would agree. Yep. Good thoughts. Thank you. And Lord willing, we'll come back and continue down the path, and then we're going to look at some early church history in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, where worship kind of took a turn for the worse. And men kind of started creating worship scenes that God never had intended, and we'll definitely spend some time talking about that. Probably Wednesday night. It will eventually get to that.
Somewhere the